Evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank to the organizers of this Herodotus Helpline, Tom and Jan, for the invitation and the opportunity to present this topic and improve my research with the contribution of specialists, mainly from other parts of the world and that don't speak Portuguese. I would like also to thank to someone that is not here, but that is very special to me and to the research center that I coordinate here in the University of Coimbra, Professor Thomas Figueira from the Rutgers University in the United States. Thank you, Tom, for all the support you give to us in Coimbra in this domain of classical studies. And now I will present my talk to you all and hope that you can help me to improve my research. This talk argues that Herodotus oh, this is not working. Sorry, I'm trying to move. First, we test it. Oh, now it is working. Okay, thank you. This talk argues that Herodotus of his histories built several narratives concerning death as colored by the concepts of nomos and anomia. This is a central subject in my background as a researcher of Herodotus. In fact, the topic goes back to my doctoral thesis published in Portuguese at the beginning of the 21st century. Partial results of that research were later published in English in Phoenix Journal, besides several articles and conferences, mainly in my mother language. To share my research on this topic with an audience of such experts as the Herodotus Helpline is for me a unique opportunity to collect in person valuable comments and suggestions. I would like first to notice that almost all the quotations of Herodotus in English translation are from Herodotus the Histories translated by Waterfield with an introduction and notes by Caroline DeWald. The structure of analysis is as follows. First, the introduction provides a state-of-the-art of studies on the topic of death in the histories. Section 1, reading notes on the concepts of death and nomos in histories, discusses the importance of these topics in building an ethical framework for the work's narratival ambience. Section 2, Kalos Thanatos, Death and Nomos in Histories, is dedicated to episodes of death where death and nomos have a cause and effect relationship resulting in different representations of what in a military context the Greeks called the beautiful death, Kalos Thanatos. Section 3, Kakos Thanatos, Death and Anomia in Histories, compiles cases where a causal link is established between death and anomia, which that might produce various instances of bad death, kakos thanatos. Section 3.1, death as a result of ethnocultural anomian. Then section 3.2, death as a result of anomia concerning philia. And finally, section 3.3, death as penalty for repeated anomia. And concluding remarks. Getting into the spirit of one of the structuring concepts of my proposed analysis, the concept of breaking the rules, anomia, I will anticipate for the opening of my talk the concluding remarks. I do so in order to convey the main results of my research at a moment when my audience is still not showing the signs of fatigue that inevitably beset us at the end of a long day's work, as will be the case with some of us. The abundance of scenes of anomia and death, the diversity of their manifestations, and the way they serve narrative causality are, in my estimation, sufficient reasons to recognize that this topic occupies an important place in the universe of Herodotian thought. From the book's Proemium and its first dramatic scene, which narrates the misfortunes of Candaulos of Lydia, there are suggestions of the mortal danger posed by any fraction of nomos. If the Trojan War marks the beginning of hostilities between barbarians and Hellenes, as we can read in Book 1, Chapter 5, the conflict was triggered, and it is important to bear this in mind, by a violation, an anomia, of a universal law, nomos, respect for the institution of hospitality, xenia. We will also see in many of the deaths narrated in histories, the author suggests that there are political motivations behind the ethical causes responsible for the violation of nomos. That is to say that whenever the characters involved in these lethal situations are connected with circles of power, political issues are also involved. For that reason, anomia can often appear to resemble a pretext to eliminate political opponents than the determining cause for applying a death penalty. Thus, the accusation of anomia in the Herodotian narrative is often also an excuse to showcase the main faults of someone in a position of authority, generally a ruler, things such as abuse of power and impunity before norms and excessive self-esteem. To this, we must add the fact that vengeance, deceit, and violations of philia, responsible for death, all of which are elements present in the opening chapters of histories, are true leitmotifs, and their repetition contributes to the work's cohesion. Not forgetting that this repetition is for the most part a consequence of the fact that they are also actions common to mankind and are therefore present in a variety of peoples, I believe it is nonetheless important to highlight its meaning as a literary narrative process. The main impression which the reader gets from this reiteration of themes and motives is, as I will try to demonstrate, not one of monotonous repetition, but rather one of variation in expository technique. As a final remark, it should be noted that infraction of nomoi, anomia, is presented in Herodotus Histories as a universal tendency. It est, rather than being an ethnic propensity or stigma, it is common to all mankind. To prove it, both Greeks and barbarians equally set in motion deviations, anomiae, that are deadly or cause death, and they are therefore unable to attain their ideal of kalos thanatos. Herodotus' histories contain so many plots and descriptions of death colored by ethnicity that several scholars have already dedicated themselves to study this topic in narrative construction. In the late 1980s, Catherine Darbo-Peskanski highlighted how the Herodotian narrator approached death with a very different way from authors in epic and tragedy. It does not portray the spectacle of dying itself. His focus falls on appraising a death morally, on describing the social operations that follow death, funerary rituals, and mainly on judging la mort comme acte. Darbo-Peskanski explains that a death can be depicted as an act of political change. Sorry. For example, the death of Cyrus raises Cambyses to the throne as military comportment, as is the case of the Spartan soldiers' deaths at Thermopylae, as an incidence of violence, a category where the narrator emphasizes the extraordinary qualities of thoma and of excess hubris, as transgression and rupture, but also as the reestablishment of order and justice. Later, Deborah Bodecker also insists on distinguishing Herodotus' descriptions of death on the battlefield from the way they are portrayed in the Iliad. Her focus fell on explaining the reasons for Herodotus' avoidance of the subjective aspect of death in combat, that is, death as an individual's experience. Because the fall of a warrior in battle might well seem ordinary, this kind of death, according to the prosaic style, deserves no detailed description, quite differently from the poetic style used in epic. Two other scholars have recently explored the theme of violent deaths. Robert Rollinger catalogs in Herodotus 92 episodes of human violence, in the sense of violence combined with acts of excessive cruelty. He identified two main criteria for the occurrence of violence in the histories: geography and ethnos. The cross-analysis of both aspects led him to test and defend the idea, and I quote, that violence represents an intrinsic medium of demarcation, separating not so much cultures, East and West, but rather political systems, autocracy and freedom. Overstride considers that Herodotus' taste for the extraordinary and marvelous was responsible for his interest in deaths and the circumstances of death. It is particularly this perspective from which he approaches deaths involving barbarian nomoi, ruses and machinations, hubris, female perpetrators, and spectacular suicides. More recently, Maria Fragulaki identified and briefly analyzed the topic of death in histories over the following perspectives: Herodotus' vocabulary of death, death in war-related contests, death and madness, punishment by death, death as a gauge of happiness, brutal means of death, treatment of the body after death, funeral customs, relics of heroes and women's involvement in contests of death. I shall try to enrich our understanding of death narratives in Herodotus' work by interpreting how that topic intersects with nomos, and with acts of transgression of nomos, rightly called anomia. Although the treatment of details connected with death is required in all descriptions of the customs of barbarian non-Greek peoples, a historiographical habit reinforcing on the status of death as a leitmotif, I shall exclude the ethnographic perspective from my analysis today. I shall therefore focus on those passages where, as I will try to demonstrate, Herodotus explores the topic of death beyond its bare acknowledgement as an inescapable event in human life. Two conclusions immediately emerge from reading the extensive list of deaths described in histories. In the Herodotian narrative, realm characters rarely die of natural or undetermined causes. Death emerges more or less explicitly in the context of a clear cause and effect relationship. We seek to identify the ethical foundations of those deaths. In this necessary process, we discover that lying behind all these modes of death, there is a basic concept of Greek thought, nomos, a term which is used here in the general sense of norms. Since men are both the producers and the products of nomoi, all acts of dying or causing death necessarily lie within this cultural mold, the norms of the society in which they take place. And this is true even when the causes of death under analysis are not in accordance with nomos, but rather transgress it, reflecting or producing what is called anomia. Herodotus offers his readers, albeit discreetly, that is, without specifying he is doing so, what I believe are true manifestations of the classical worldview on death and the norms that constitute custom, usage, also nomos. Let us briefly look into the theoretical frameworks he implicitly provides throughout his work, is assisting the reader in the interpretation of the many situations where the values under discussion are put into practice. That is why I have chosen to denominate the passages where the concepts of death and nomos anomia are programmatically explained as reading notes on different episodes where the cause and effect relationship that is established with that triangular death, nomos, anomia set of values and behaviors is practically demonstrated. The passages that provide us with the reading notes of the theme under analysis are the following: Croesus' interview with Solon, Darius' interview with Calatian Indians and Greeks, Polycrates' good fortune and death, Xerxes' interview with Demaratus. Let us start with the definition of death as a mirror of moral values. In Croesus' interview with Solon, Herodotus presents in the form of dramatic discourse a program for ethical reading of death situations. The characters in this scene are intentionally a barbarian, the king of Lydia, and a Greek, an Athenian sage, which enables Herodotus to teach a universalizing lesson on the human condition, while emphasizing their underlying distinctive cultural specificities. The different mind frames of the two characters involved in this performance of the ethical meaning of death mirror two stereotypes. On the one hand, that of the materialistic barbaros, who measures happiness on the basis of the tangible possessions of the obvious, prosperous man. And on the other hand, that of an elite Greek, who accordingly, with a mentality inherited from the archaic times, does not conceive material prosperity as possible without the possession of various existential qualities. The Solonian qualities of being obvious in Herodotus' Logos are goods like honor, time, on the battlefield and in athletic competitions, devotion to gods, and good fortune, eutychia. To qualify as fortunate eutyches, a man must meet some of the following criteria: a prosperous life without disgrace, a healthy and exemplary progeny, in accordance with the aristocratic code of Kagatia, and, what is paramount for our argument, a happy end of life. In other words, a clash of mentalities could anticipate it. Croesus, the possessor of immense wealth, is not recognized by his guest as the happiest of men, obiotatos, since, as the narrative of his life will soon demonstrate, the material riches he has amassed have not prevented him from having a son who was physically disabled, he was deaf, and another one, his designated successor, who had died, or from being himself on the verge of an ignominious death amid the flames of a pyre raised by the enemy who conquered his kingdom, Cyrus of Persia. This end-of-life narrative pictures a death that can be fairly called a kakos thanatos, although the phrase is not used explicitly. However, the decisive factor for a man to be granted the vaunted title of fortunate is made manifest in death, as the Athenian host repeats 3 times in sequential passages of chapter 32, book 1. Chapter 32 evokes canonical aphorisms, such as that human insolence awakens divine envy, which often punishes the ruthless with death. This entire ethical framework dictates an understanding of death as a decisive criterion for accessing the meaning of someone's life. That is, only at the end of one's journey, when fate has been fulfilled and the person is no longer subject to further vicissitudes, it is possible to know whether or not that individual has attained happiness, eudaimonia. We should also remember that the notion that no person can be considered happy before the end of their days was part of a long roster of maxims of Greek popular morality that were also echoed by the 3 great ethics tragedians, as you can see in the slide. The narration of the good fortune and death of Polycrates of Samos appears to me as a true ideological complement to the experience of Croesus, and serves to demonstrate how the moral principles in histories are universal and not restricted by any racial prejudice that might be present in the Greek barbarian dichotomy. This plot plays out on larger political scale the principles established verbally in the short interchange between Croesus and Solon, as is the case for the idea that an act of insolence, hubris, or a precursor act leading to its manifestation is dangerous behavior because it may drag the perpetrator into ruin. Polycrates' permanent good fortune and Croesus' floating of his prosperity are not exceptions. The solidarity required by the Pact of Hospitality compels Amasis to warn the Greek tyrant against threats from the gods, which are imperceptible to minds incapable of seeing beyond appearances, such as that of Polycrates. The excessive bounty of Polycrates' fortune is translated into endless military success, both at sea and on land. The pharaoh warns his philos of the danger that his disproportionate prosperity might awaken divine jealousy. In fact, Herodotus' biography of the Greek tyrant has portrayed him as a hubristes deserving of divine punishment. Besides being a fratricide, he had an unbridled ambition for wealth, coupled with an excessive confidence in his reasoning skills, which makes him responsible for his hate, tragic blind ruination. Finally, his thirst for riches led him to accept a monetary arrangement with Oroetes, the Persian satrap, while turning a deaf ear to diviners and even to his own daughter, who advised him to repudiate this connection. The reception which this false philos Oroetes had in store for him upon his arrival at Magnesia is indescribably atrocious and incommensurable with the tyrant and his image. In the description of Polycrates' death by impalement, the expression death destroyed in an evil manner, the aftere kakos, confirms the fact that the last moment of a man's journey, in this case a kakos thanatos, is what determines the final evaluation of his entire life. In sum, the logoi about Croesus and Polycrates undoubtedly present, in the general ambit of histories, the moments where the ethical valence of death in Herodotian thought is best explained in paradigmatic terms, as well as most clearly illustrated. The notion that the way life ends and the circumstances of dying, ending, teleutein, are the determining factors for classifying a person as a happy or a miserable being leads Herodotus to represent the deaths of his characters according to two paradigms. Beautiful, kalos, beautiful death, kalos thanatos, and bad death, kakos thanatos. Although I use two phrases not found explicitly in Herodotus' test for ease of conceptualization. But before we look into some of the episodes that illustrate these two different readings of death in histories, we must consider the author's personal vision concerning the customs, nomoi, that serve as a framework for the acts of giving or receiving death, that is, the act of killing and the act of dying. The word nomos, as Jacqueline de Romilly aptly puts it, general means all sorts of rules in all peoples. As concerns its historical evolution, there was added in its first ethnographic meaning, that is, the practice and beliefs handed down from generation to generation since time immemorial as the ethical legacy of a given people, The political meaning of law during the development of the Athenian polis in the 5th century. Our discussion here concerns the ethnic connotation of the word. Throughout in his work, Herodotus scatters a number of statements which, when juxtaposed, enable his reader to understand the ethical profile of his concept of nomos. Let us now review that profile. It becomes clear from his outright condemnation of acts of profanation of tombs and shrines in Egypt carried out by Cambyses, that Herodotus views a people's fundamental customs as inviolable. Hence, his concluding words in Cambyses' portrait, "Everything goes to make me certain that Cambyses was completely mad, otherwise he would not have gone in for mocking religion and tradition." Book 3, chapter 38. As Paul Demont rightly argued, this episode demonstrates that nomos is much more than a use, a custom. It can be a belief and a thought. The notion that a people's customs form their identity structure is confirmed in Book 7, chapter 152, where Herodotus affirms his belief that each people deem their own customs to be better than those of everyone else. Moreover, as a code of values and behavior, nomos requires respect and fidelity, just as a king expects obedience from his subjects. This image of the sovereignty of customs over individuals is inspired by the author's comment about Darius allegedly urging groups of his subjects to adopt the funeral rites of other peoples. The Greeks should practice the necrophagy of Galatian Indians, and the latter should adopt the Hellenic practice of cremation. After Darius' interlocutors' complete refusal to do so, Herodotus comments, and I quote, "So these practices have become enshrined as customs just as they are, and I think Pindar was right to have said in this poem that custom is king of all." The same image of sovereign custom, despotes nomos, is used in Book 7, 104, in the Spartan king Demaratus' words to Xerxes, and I quote, "That's how the Lacedaemonians are. They're as good as anyone in the world when it comes to fight one-on-one, but they're the best when it comes to fight in groups. The point is that although they are free, they are not entirely free. Their master is the law, and they are far more afraid to this than your men are of you." It thus becomes clear, as G.H. Evans has explained, how nomos works as a principle of historic causality for the reason that it puts pressure on the members of its cultural community, providing reasons and motivation for their actions. Thus, operating as a mechanism for instilling conformity and guiding human activity in the restricted domain of the group that embodies it, nomos becomes a characteristic pattern of behavior and is therefore predictable. In these circumstances, we may say that nomos becomes a second nature and almost gains the status of physis. Having discussed death and nomos, we can now understand the rationale behind my bipartite division of the analysis of death events in histories. We shall now start by considering the deaths occasioned by codes of honor, another aspect of nomoi, and which result in beautiful deaths, kaloi thanatoi. Then we shall look into bad deaths, kakoi thanatoi, either deaths occasioned by the transgression of established codes or deaths that constitute in themselves true acts of anomia. For the sake of time, I will discuss only a selection of the episodes analyzed in my book, Death in Herodotus Histories. As the culmination of a lifetime, dignity or elevation in death, or kalos thanatos, represents in its original sense the practical adherence to the values of a code of military honor. Therefore, we must first consider the configuration of beautiful death within the ambit of war, which is the context in which the Greeks placed it most conspicuously. However, reaching the ideal of an honorable death, the supreme gift of happiness, does not mean merely to reach your life's end in accordance with the laws, the nomoi, of warrior ethics. The treatment given to soldiers' dead bodies in particular, and generally to any person, is instrumental in the accomplishment of the will to be die with dignity, the teleutein kalos or teleutein eu, mentioned in chapter 32, book 3. As the story of the Athenian Telos shows, a proper burial is a crucial aspect of a warrior's honorable death. The archaic Athenians could recognize the excellence of their fallen warriors by awarding them a public funeral. To describe the Spartan profile of warrior excellence, Herodotus provides both a theoretical presentation of the elements that help identify a soldier citizen as an excellent warrior, aner agathos, and practical examples of their performance on the battlefield. The dialogue between Xerxes and Demaratus is the key to understanding the close relationship between the kalos, thanatos, and nomos. As the Spartan king in exile explains, merit, arete, for the Greeks in general and for the Lacedaemonians in particular, results from the interaction of wisdom, Sophia, with the compelling law, nomos iskyros, book 7, chapter 102. As concerns Spartan warrior merit, this nomos required the soldier never to abandon his post, the place where he was supposed either to be victorious or to die. It is also important to note that the adjective kalos, that we have translated as beautiful, has not only a moral sense as a synonym of noble, but also an aesthetic meaning, the physical beauty of individuals. Therefore, the reference to Spartan soldiers' habit of grooming their hair before going into battle, chapter 209, book 7, causes no surprise, and this behavior may be seen as gesture in advance of the prosthesis of a potential funeral, with the warriors making sure that their dead bodies will look beautiful. But let us not forget another passage in histories, occurring in the aftermath of the Battle of Plataea, where the Homeric motif of admiring the physical beauty of an enemy killed in action is recast through the character of Mecistius, the Persian, about whom the author writes, and I quote, Book 9, Chapter 25. Mecistius had been remarkably tall and good-looking, which is in fact why they did this with the body. And the man broke ranks to go and see him. Evidence of the practical application of this warrior kalos thanatos is provided in an episode at Thermopylae. Motivated by the idea of a fair sacrifice in the name of personal Time and their land, the Greeks who were faithful to Leonidas, the Spartans, the Thespians, and the Thebans though supposedly against their will, are aware of the fact that in advancing against the Persians, they are starting a march towards death. I believe that their understanding of that hand as kalos thanatos is what explains the fact that instead of being discouraged, those men feel their strength revive, as described in Book 7, Chapter 2 to 3. And I quote, "For the Greeks knew they were going to die at the hands of the Persians, who had come around the mountain. And so they spared none of their strength, but fought the enemy with reckless disregard for their lives." By praising the fallen warriors of both armies in the aftermath of the battle, the author carefully ensures the required impartiality of historical narrative. And although the highest distinction of excellent warrior, Aristos, is awarded to the Spartan general, both his comrades and a number of the Persians equally merit the acknowledge of having become famous names, onomastoi. By way of conclusion to section 2, we may say that according to Herodotus' universal vision of history, kalos thanatos is granted as an award of glory to both Greeks and barbarians without inherent distinction. In this last section, I will consider cases where violations of the established nomoi, anomiae, have extremely penalizing consequences for the offenders, that is, a disgraceful death, a form of kakos thanatos. The principles that guide a person's conduct fall into two different orders of social formation: the ethnic, which includes the norms adopted by a given people as features of their individuality as a group, or the universal, where norms apply generally to the whole of humanity. Thus, the third part of my analysis is organized into three topics based on this distinction between universal conduct, between ethnic and universal conduct principles. First, I shall look into some instances of deaths resulting from the infringement of the specific values of certain people, ethnos. Second, I shall discuss cases of deaths that arise from a departure from a universal ethical principle of philia. And third, I will be looking into some cases where death is the punishment for different modes of anomia of both ethnic and universal principles. This part of my treatment must include two different perspectives on the causal link between a transgression of nomos and anomia and death. Anomia is the result either of a deviation from a code of ethics as a whole, or of a transgression that concerns only some of the areas which that code includes, such as its social, religious, military, or legal aspects. Because I have written elsewhere about some of the most emblematic cases of specific anomia, social anomia, as presented in the episodes of Candaules and Gyges, and the Persian ambassadors of the court of Amintas of Macedonia in the article Phoenix, I shall now focus on a case of transgression of the code of values and behavior of the Scythians in general, a non-Greek people who Herodotus considers the most xenophobic of all peoples. The deaths of Anacharsis and Scylas are clear examples of Scythian fundamentalism concerning their traditions and their contempt for other people's ethos, as one can read in the closing words of Herodotus' narration of these two dramas. And I quote, "The Scythians are so conservative then that this is how they treat people who adopt foreign ways." What crimes did the two members of the Scythian royal house commit that led to their destruction? They had assimilated Greek customs. In particular, their death sentences were brought about by a guilty decision for worshipping orgiastic gods, Cybele and Dionysos, and practicing their rites. Since they are aware that indulging, whether sporadically or frequently, in foreign practices, Greek in the case under discussion, is seen by their fellow countrymen as a punishable act, both Anacharsis and Scylas took precautions, trying to hide their deviation, anomia, from other Scythians. This caution involved choosing a place that might ensure the utmost secrecy for their moment or moments, in Scylas' cases, of communion with Hellenic culture. Anacharsis fulfills the vow that he had made to Cybele in Cyzicus and holds a night festival on his lands, an area thickly covered with trees. Scylas, who wished to prolong his dedication to Greek nomoi for as long as possible, chooses a long-term solution. He spends certain periods of the year, sometimes over a month, hidden within the protective walls of the Greek colony of Olbia, where he lives completely a Hellenic way of life and practices the manners of his favorite culture, which had been handed down to him by his mother. Both dramas end with transgressor's death. In this last event, the fates of these two young Scythians, tainted by anomia, coincide again. According to Herodotus, Anacharsis was struck by an arrow shot by his brother Saulius and was instantly killed. As for Scylas, he first took refuge in Thrace with the Odrysians at his uncle's palace, and ended up becoming a bargaining chip, with his uncle delivering him to his brother, who had taken his place as king back to Scythia. Scylas was then beheaded on the spot. The political background of these affairs indicates that despite Herodotus' presentation of their tragic endings as caused by acts of ethnic anomia, his account incorporates other elements which are suggestive of the operation of specific political factors behind the deaths of these two Scythians. The relationships of cooperation, sometimes denoted by the word philia, established between individuals can be classified into three fundamental, thought not mutually exclusive categories: the familial, the sociopolitical, and the military. I shall now focus on some examples of sociopolitical philia, In monarchic regimes, philia fundamentally takes the form of loyalty to the king. A transgression anomia of this rule, of this nomos, can range from plain disobedience to the monarch to the extreme case of rebellion, apostasis. Even if in the first case death may seem excessive as a penalty, the truth is that because of its frequency, its application to all traitors becomes a conventional rule. In this respect, it is important to notice that Herodotus does not blindly align with traditional popular morality. The historian also portrays episodes of wrongdoers, anomos, who escape punishment, and assuming a universal vision of history, presents the capital punishment of traitors and the betrayal of philia as a practice common both to non-Greeks, barbarians, and Greeks. Although they have committed a great anomia against the religious respect of the messengers' lives, the Athenians who killed the Darius heralds in 490 before Christ were not directly punished for their sacrilegious act. Book 7, chapter 133. In Book 3, on the contrary, the Greek mercenaries of the Egyptian king Amasis punish their countryman Phanes' betrayal of military philia by slaughtering his children in front of their father's eyes. Book 3, 11. Before we consider further examples, almost all of them concerning barbarian peoples, that confirm the guilt punishment contest under discussion, let us try to understand how it relates to the ethical criteria associated with royalty. As happens with other non-Greek sovereigns, Astyages of Media, Croesus of Lydia, and Cambyses of Persia, the end of Cyrus' reign is revealed to him during his sleep through a death dream. In fact, that dream contains a foreboding of his end through an image of one king replacing another. Like his predecessor, Astyages, and his heir, Cambyses, Cyrus misinterprets his night vision opsis. Their mistake, resulting from the blindness that hinders them from knowing the truth, will invariably lead them to ruin. In the present case, the king believes he is being forewarned by the gods that a traitor, Darius, the firstborn of one of his trusted men, Hystaspes, will conspire against him. It is precisely in the answer given by that Achaemenid's father that the definition of the nomos concerning the treatment of traitors is found, and I quote, "My lord, may there not be any man born of a Persian who is plotting against you. If there is, let him die as quickly as possible, as far as I am concerned. If your dream tells you that my younger son is conspiring against you, I hand him over to you for you to deal with as you see fit." In short, according to Persian tradition, nomos, shared by monarchical regimes in general and in an Herodotian perspective, conspirators are punished with death. The practical illustration of the nomos that requires a death sentence for traitors is well documented in an episode concerning the Ionian Revolt, Book 6, Chapter 4. This uprising of the Asian Greeks against the Persian dominion supposedly begins in Susa with Histiaeus of Miletus, whom Darius had previously called to his court. He had sought to gather support for the rebellion both among his countrymen and among Persians who might be dissatisfied with their king's policies. The fate of the Persians insurgents illustrates how the denunciation of the rebellion results in the execution of the offenders. The man to whom Histiaeus had entrusted some letters to be delivered to the Persians at Sardis, inciting them to join the rebellion, gave them instead to Artaphernes, the satrap of Lydia, a brother of Darius, who put many of the prospective traitors to death. However, the Persian monarchic nomos also included showing respect towards defeated kings, who might come to occupy a position of prestige with the victorious great king. As Herodotus explains, Book 3, Chapter 15, difference for fellow kings who had been lowered to the position of subjects was part of Persian tradition. And I quote, "Since the Persians tend to honor the sons of kings, they even give the sons of kings who have rebelled against them their kingdom back." But as we have just seen in Herodotus' narrative about the fate of the Persian man who had joined Histiaeus in his plot against Darius, if someone was found to be a traitor, that is, if they had committed an act of anomia against political philia, they would be put to death. To avoid the public humiliation of an execution, Psammetichus, the pharaoh, chose to commit suicide when Cambyses was informed of his plans, regaining his lost honor through self-inflicted death. Book 3, Chapter 15. The ultimate proof of the major role of nomos in the worldview of histories emerges as a moralizing paradigm from the portrait of a number of characters whose death represents the price paid for their repeated transgression, anomia, of the different codes, social, political, religious, or military, that guide human conduct. The biographies of two kings of the Persian dynasty, Cyrus and Cambyses, are an expression of the preponderance of the cause, anomia, and the effect, thanatos, relationship in the designing of their narrative arcs. However, while at times exemplifying a paradigm recognized in critical literary tradition for representing the other, the author does expose the same lack of sophrosune among his fellow countrymen, using examples of great names in the east of Hellas, Periander of Corinth, Cleomenes I of Sparta, and Polycrates of Samos. This serves to show that neither common sense nor immoderation are solely determined by race or culture, but rather depend on the rules, nomoi, by which one lives. From the historian's perspective, the most extreme examples of insolent, contemptuous men, hubris type, emerge within absolute power systems, as monarchs or tyrants. In the case of all these figures, capital punishment should be understood as an exemplary fate also applicable to other similar men. I would like to illustrate this Herodotian narrative process through the discussion of the portrait of a Greek tyrant, Periander of Corinth. A number of parallels can be drawn between this specific character and others who might be termed repeated practitioners of anomia. As a non-Greek Cambyses, for example, shares with Periander the transgression of both familial philia and political philia. The targets of the Greek tyrant were thus his wife and the son, who was supposed to inherit his authority. However, differently from the Persian king, he was indeed directly involved in his wife's death, again by way of illustration of the Greek pessimistic view contained in the notion that, apropos of Cambyses, and I quote, because men's lives are generally beset by many misfortunes, Book 3, Chapter 33. Herodotus establishes a logical sequence of unfortunate events in Periander's life, which include the demise of his wife, Melissa, and their son's death. In point of fact, according to the author, after the death of his wife, another unfortunate event befell the Corinthian. His own son, Lycophron, whom he wished to become his successor, was killed at the hands of the Corcyraeans. As concerns familial circumstances, a parallel between Periander and another barbarian king, Croesus the Lydian, becomes obvious. Like Croesus, only one of his two male children, the other had a mental disability, was fit to inherit his father's power. In both cases, this was exactly the son who would be murdered. There is a further coincidence in the fates of the two young heirs, Attis of Lydia and Lycophron of Corinth. Their deaths are foretold through privileged forms of divine revelation, a dream and an oracle, respectively. Notwithstanding their differences, the two episodes demonstrate how parents who are guilty of anomia experience payment for their crimes with their heirs' lives. Like Polycrates of Samos and the Lydian Croesus, Herodotus' portrait of Periander is, as Griffin has pointed out in the popular sense of the word, tragic. In Periander's case, the reason for his son's death was a deed of violence carried out by the citizens of Corcyra as a preemptive act of anticipation of Periander's relocation among them. It is therefore legitimate to ask, did the Corcyraeans kill Lycophron only to exclude Periander, as Herodotus suggests, or was it because the young man who was governing the Corinthian colony was also learning how to rule tyrannically? Again, it is up to Herodotus' readers to identify subtle political implications in his text. The biography of the Corinthian tyrant, which the reader can extract from the text, makes him directly responsible for his wife's death and indirectly for his son's. Furthermore, he is also responsible for killing many of his subjects, behavior that raises him above even the bloodthirsty reputation of his father, the tyrant Cypselus. And he is the author of the public humiliation of Corinthian women, both free women and female slaves. In sum, Periander combined acts of familial and socio-political anomia, and finally pays with his life for his multiple transgressions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I finish my presentation with a beautiful photo of our last international meeting here in Coimbra of the Celtic Conference, and hoping that soon we can join with no fear from each other. Thank you very much.